All right, everyone. It sounds like we fixed whatever that audio problem was that we had before. Hopefully, everyone has had an opportunity to take the poll questions that are up right now. How familiar your organization is with TAM, and to describe your organization. This afternoon, we're going to present the Transit Asset Management Final Rule Small Systems Focus presentation. My name is Mshadoni Smith, and I'll be your presenter today. As you already know, all of the listening capabilities are over your computer speakers, and please be sure to adjust the sound directly on your computer if you're having any difficulty. If during the presentation you have any logistical or technical issues, please use the Q&A pod. So let me take you off around the room for a couple of housekeeping items. In the lower left-hand corner, you will see the Q&A pod. It's somewhat different than what we have used in previous webinars, but it is there for you to put any questions you have during the presentation or throughout the presentation, and someone will respond to you. Next, on the middle left-hand side of your screen is the Notes pod. There are several pieces of important information in the Notes pod and a few web pages that you can refer to find the Federal Register notice for the final rule, as well as the Federal Register notice for both of the infrastructure and facility guidebooks, which are currently open for notice and comment. Just scroll down on your Notes pod and you will find those web pages in there. And lastly, in the upper left-hand corner is the File Share pod. In this pod, you will find copies of all of the presentations in the TAM webinar series, from the Final Rule for All Operator presentation, the NTD Asset Inventory Requirements presentation, the TAM Performance Measures presentation, and today's TAM Small System Focus presentation. You can either download all files or select which ones are of interest to you and download those directly. In addition, at the end of the webinar series, we will be posting information from all of the webinars, including recordings, transcripts, Q&As, and the presentations. As I mentioned before, my name is Mshadoni Smith. I work with FTA's Office of Budget and Policy, and I am the Transit Asset Management Program Manager. I will be presenting the presentation today, and here are a few other contacts in the TAM program. So let's get started. Oh, I did want to mention that we are recording today's webinar, and a copy of that will be available at the end of the webinar series. Also, at the bottom of your screen, you will find a caption pod so that you could read along if you have problems with your audio or hearing impaired. And as I mentioned, a transcript will be available at the end of the webinar series. So today we're going to cover the TAM background, final rule provisions specifically focused for small providers, some implementation information, and also talk about technical assistance. If you have participated in any of our prior webinars, a lot of this information will be the same. So what is transit asset management? Transit asset management is a business model that uses condition of assets to optimize funding with the goal of the state of good repair. Graphically speaking, this is a representation of the current backlog. The horizontal line represents the around $86 billion backlog, where a backlog is where a transit asset enters or meets the rating of 2.5 on the term scale. The left-hand side of your screen represents the backlog in 2030, and the bottom of your screen represents annual expenditures in billions of dollars. Both of these figures are in 2010 dollars. The diagonal line is a trend line that gives an estimate of where the backlog would be based on how much annual spending we put into preservation or to minimizing the backlog. If we wanted to continue to spend what we currently do on state of good repair, which is $10.3 billion, the backlog would be at $140 billion in 2030. If we just wanted to maintain the backlog and spent $12.7 billion a year, and if we wanted to actually eliminate the backlog, we'd need to spend $18.5 billion a year. So the difference between the current spending and the amount necessary annually to eliminate the backlog is $8.2 billion. Well, we don't have an additional $8.2 billion to spend available for state of good repair. So we have to do more with what we already have. Some of the anticipated benefits of transit asset management are the improved transparency and accountability, optimized capital investment and maintenance decisions, and more data-driven maintenance decisions. Another potential outcome could be safety benefits. In 2012, MAP 21 instituted a performance management framework and mandate both FTA and FHWA develop performance-based rules. This transit asset management rule is one of 3 FTA regulations, and you can see on the right-hand side of this screen there are a number of corollary federal highway regulations. At the bottom, the linking statewide and metropolitan planning regulation bridges the gap with regard to planning. This graphic shows the interrelationship amongst the FTA regulations. On the left-hand side is the agency safety plan regulation. In the center is the TAM regulation, and on the right-hand side is the transportation planning. You can see that asset inventory and condition assessments can lead to identification of hazards and risk assessments. Likewise, coordinating targets between safety and state of good repair can help planners develop MPO and statewide performance targets. So what process did we take to get here? In 2012, MAP 21 mandate that we develop this regulation, and we immediately went out and did some informal research in the way of an online dialogue. In 2013, FTA published their Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking in conjunction with the Office of Safety, and we set out some of our initial thoughts on what should be the regulation. Last year, in 2015, we published our Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which had a more refined proposal of what we planned to enact, and it decoupled from the safety rulemaking. About 1 month after that notice closed, the FAST Act passed, and fortunately, it maintained the mandate from MAP 21. And just 2 weeks ago, we published the final rule in the Federal Register. So now I'm going to go through that actual final rule provisions, identifying exactly what is mandated. These 5 sections are the same as were in the NPRM, and many of the provisions have only been refined in this stage of the regulation. And to that end, I will identify where the changes from the NPRM to the final rule for those of you who have followed along through the rulemaking process. Those of you that this may be your first entry into this topic, do not worry. We will walk through all of the regulations, but we will pay special attention and highlight where there are changes by the delta triangle symbol up in the upper left-hand corner. On this page, you can see a listing of the most significant refinements from the NPRM to the final rule stage. I will go through each of them in a lot more detail throughout the provisions, but just briefly to hit on a couple of items. The definitions of Tier 2 provider were given a little bit more information on how to determine if you were a Tier 2 provider, and explicitly stated that American Indian tribes were Tier 2 providers regardless of funding source. Next, the asset inventory scope for equipment and third-party assets was more structured and more clearly identified. The next change was the 5310 applicability, which I'll get to very shortly, and I'm sure is of interest to this group as it is focused on smaller systems and state DOTs. The 5310 applicability, we refined to clarify that it's only providers of public transportation. So closed-door service would not be subject to this rule. I'll get to that slide in a couple minutes, and we'll spend a little bit of time with that. And the last major change was in regards to group plans. We made sure that it was clear that a group plan sponsor is not the accountable executive for their group plan participants, and that small urban providers are not required to be a part of a group plan given by a state DOT or other direct or designated recipient. But they are eligible to participate, but it must be a mutual decision. So let's go ahead and get started on those general provisions. So the purpose is to help achieve and maintain a state of good repair for the nation's public transportation systems, and it's applicable to all recipients and subrecipients under Chapter 53. So clarifying who that actually includes, especially with regard to the subrecipients, we clarified the definition of public transportation, which is from the USC 5302, and it means regular continuing shared ride service, shared ride surface transportation services that are open to the general public or open to a segment of the general public defined by age, disability, or low income. So if your service is only to a exclusive a group of people for, I have to look up an example, then you would not be subject to the TAM regulation. So next, the National Transit Asset Management System. These are the 5 pillars of the TAM system From map 21, we had to define the state of good repair, require TAM plans for all recipients and subrecipients, establish performance measures, identify reporting requirements, and identify technical assistance that we will provide to recipients and subrecipients. So the definition of state of good repair is the condition in which a capital asset is able to operate at a full level of performance. And that definition has three objective standards. If it's able to perform its design function, it does not pose a known unacceptable safety risk, and it meets its life cycle investments, or it has recovered them. Each of these objective standards must be met in order to be considered in a state of good repair. Life cycle investments includes a scheduled maintenance or the schedule for maintenance and upgrades for an asset. So transit asset management and state of good repair, the relationship between them, the purpose of the TAM system is to keep our nation's asset in a state of good repair. So TAM is the process, SGR is the goal. So next, let's talk a little bit more about the TAM plans. Here, you'll notice there is a delta in the upper right-hand corner, so it indicates there's been a change from the NPRM. You'll see that in this slide, we have more clearly identified how to determine if you're a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 operator. Since this presentation is geared towards Tier 2 or smaller transit operators, I'm going to go through that definition first. And it means a subrecipient of 5311 funds, or someone who is part of the rural program, an American Indian tribe, or a transit provider that has 100 or fewer vehicles across all fixed route modes, or has 100 or fewer vehicles in one non-fixed route mode. So let's go to a poll. Based on that definition, would you be a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 operator? Please take a second to fill out this poll. All right, thank you for filling out the poll. It's come to my attention that some of you are still having some difficulty with the audio. I just want to remind you that there is no call-in number for this presentation. It is exclusively over your computer speakers. If you have calls into a telephone line, then that's not for this webinar. All right, so I'm going to carry on. It does look like we have marketed to the appropriate audience. We have mostly Tier 2 operators here. We've got a couple of Tier 1 folks. Well, everyone is welcome. I just want to bring to those Tier 1 folks' attention that we are focusing on the small operators and in some instances, which I will point out, the state DOTs. So you may want to download the final rule presentation and see the additional slides that would apply to a Tier 1 operator. So now let's talk about the responsibility for the TAM plan development. Each transit provider must have their own accountable executive, and that person is someone who is eligible to approve both their transit asset management plan and their safety plan. With regard to plan coordination, a Tier 2 provider has the option to participate in a group plan or to develop their own TAM plan. In a couple of slides, we'll talk about what's included, which elements are included in a TAM plan, and give you a little bit more insight about the benefits of participating in a group plan. A group plan participant must collaborate with the group plan sponsor in the development of that plan. And the TAM plan development activity is eligible under these program codes. So again, let's talk a little bit about who is a group plan. I'd like to direct you guys also to our TAM webpage. It's www.transit.dot.gov/TAM. It has a lot of good information on there, and one of the things that it has on there are checklists under the Getting Started page. Those checklists identify if you should be a group plan sponsor, if you should participate in a group plan, and how to identify if you're a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 participant. In addition to those checklists, there's also a compliance checklist which could help you identify what pieces of information you need to gather and have on hand to be compliant with the final rule. So group plans are compiled by a sponsor, and that sponsor is the state DOT or the designated or direct recipient. As I mentioned previously, small urban operators are not required to be offered a group plan as other subrecipients are, but can be based on mutual agreement between sponsor and operator. Tier 2 providers may participate in a single group plan, or they can choose to opt out and develop their own TAM plan. So as I mentioned before, here is a list of the TAM plan elements. The first 4 are required for all tier providers, and the last 5 are only Tier 1 providers. We will go over the first 4 in a little bit more detail. So the inventory of capital assets. As you see, there's a delta in the upper right corner. There has been some refinement from the NPRM, mainly in the asset inventory scope. So inventory is a listing of all capital assets that are owned by the transit provider. It includes third-party assets, exclusive use facilities, and does not include third-party equipment. When it comes to equipment, we are including only those assets greater than $50,000 replacement value? Purchase value, purchase value, and all non-service vehicles. the asset inventory should be at the same level of detail as the capital program of projects. You can use existing inventories such as rolling stock and equipment reports to develop your asset inventory. And all assets are required to be in an asset inventory, not just FTA-funded assets. Here is an example of asset categories and classes. The next element is condition assessment, and this is a rating of the inventory assets. And it doesn't have to be on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5. There's no required methodology. It could be based on age, good, fair, poor rating, or percentage of residual life. It's local decision. But those ratings should be sufficient to monitor performance and plan capital investments. Condition assessments can be collected at the individual or the asset class level. Again, that is a local decision. Condition assessments also may include vulnerabilities to natural climate and hazards. And also, condition assessments are only required for assets with direct capital responsibility. So I'm going to spend a couple more seconds on this slide and identify that group plan participants may, or the group plan sponsor would identify the elements of the condition assessment. For instance, what type of rating system that would be used, whether assessments would be collected at individual or asset level for their groups. We are only requiring the condition assessments for assets where there is a direct capital responsibility, because without the financial aspect, you can't influence the condition of the asset. So here's another slide representing some of the conceptual differences between the asset inventory and assessing the condition. So for each of the 4 required asset categories, here is a listing of what's included in the asset inventory, and then also what's included in assessing the condition. The third element of a TAM plan is a decision support tool. I always make sure to highlight that this is not a requirement for software. This is just a description of what type of process, analytic process, was used to determine your prioritization, to estimate capital investment needs over time, and assisting in prioritization of investments. And then lastly is the investment prioritization. And this is a ranked listing of projects and programs ordered by year. Prioritization is locally determined based on policies and need. It does need to consider identified unacceptable safety risks and accessibility requirements. It should be fiscally constrained based on estimated funding levels, not just FTA, but from all sources. Let's take another quick poll. Please take a second to fill out this poll. Based on our description of a group plan, do you think that you will participate in a group plan or do one on your own? And how much does your agency already do of those elements that we discussed? All right, folks, it's brought to my attention again that seems like this phone line is still having a couple of issues. We're going to see if we could correct it, but right now it seems like it's okay. All right, we're going to get started. Thank you again for filling out the poll. That's kind of interesting with regard to the group plan. It looks like there's more folks that are going to do their own group plan or do their own plan than do a group plan. But that's not nearly the number of folks that are in the room. So maybe there's some of you folks that are shy. But that's okay. I won't put you on the spot. We're going to go back to our presentation, and hopefully we won't have any more audio problems. So let's talk a little bit more about those TAM plans. So the TAM plan time frames. Each plan would need to be updated in its entirety at least every 4 years, which would coincide with the statewide transportation improvement plan and the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program. It will cover at least 4 years, and there is an option for amending the plan during the time frame, during the horizon time frame. Identifying what determines an amendment versus an update is also a local decision and something that a group plan sponsor would share with their participants. The initial TAM plans must be completed no later than 2 years after the effective date. So that would be October 2018. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about performance management. Here are the 4 asset categories. You'll notice that the infrastructure category is grayed out because by definition, no Tier 2 provider can have rail, and the infrastructure is for rail fixed guideway. So it's grayed out, but we wanted to make sure you knew what that performance measure was for. So we have equipment, rolling stock, and facilities. 2 of these performance measures are age-based, and they use a useful life benchmark, or ULB, as their measure of condition, whereas facilities uses an actual condition measure. I would like to point out again that FTA has 2 guidebooks currently open for notice and comment in the Federal Register. One of them specifically talks about the facility performance measure. I encourage each and every one of you to go and look at that guidebook during its draft phase and make any comments that you have that would help to improve the ultimate result. So this next slide is a tabular representation of those performance measures for each of the asset categories. As you see, the infrastructure measure is still grayed out, but the equipment, rolling stock, and facilities are identified there. So from assessing condition to performance targets, we have further narrowed the asset scope. For example, equipment asset category in the top line. To assess the condition, it says only the equipment with direct capital responsibility and no third-party assets. However, in order to calculate a performance measure, we only use non-revenue service vehicles. So for that performance target, percentage of vehicles that have met or exceeded their useful life, that only applies to non-revenue service vehicles. So if you're noticing a trend as we move down the provisions in the final rule, that we are refining and narrowing the scope from asset inventory to assessing conditions to performance targets. So please keep that in mind. And with regard to those targets, those are annual targets and should be supported by the data, which includes your most recent condition data and reasonable financial projections over the 4-year period. Targets for group plans apply to the group as a whole. So if there are 5 participants in a group plan, then all 5 of them can play a part in achieving the goal. It's not necessarily each person is responsible for that goal independently. But again, that is something that is determined by the group plan sponsor in coordination with the group plan participants. These targets are reported annually to the NTD, and here is a URL that you can take a look at that talks a little bit more about the asset inventory modules. And I believe there is another webinar that is taking place next Tuesday that will go over the NTD asset inventory information. So I mentioned the term useful life benchmark, or ULB, a few minutes back with regard to the performance targets, and I just want to clarify that a useful life benchmark is not the same thing as useful life for FTA grant programs. It's been described to me as the minimum and the maximum useful life, where useful life for FTA grant programs is the minimum age where you can apply for replacement assistance, and a useful life benchmark is the maximum age or life of your asset before it enters the state of good repair backlog. So they are not equivalent terms, and the next slide will show this in terms of actual numbers. In addition, FTA will be providing default values for the useful life as a output of the term model. However, we're also allowing operators to submit their own useful life benchmarks, which are customized to their specific operating environment and other elements that impact the maximum life. So as I just mentioned, here is a table that shows the difference between the useful life benchmark and the useful life that is used in grant programs. For example, a ferry boat, the useful life benchmark is 42 years, and that indicates the maximum life based on the information we have in the term model that a ferry boat would achieve before it enters the state of good repair backlog. So basically, at 42 years, a ferry boat is at a rating of 2.5 on the term scale. Alternatively, the grant program, you can apply for a replacement of a ferry boat at 8 years. So let's talk about the record keeping and reporting requirements for this final rule. So really the reporting requirements, there are only explicitly 2, but they're broken out into various pieces. And all of the reports are due to the NTD. Because you're providing your TAM data to the NTD does not necessarily mean you have to report NTD information. The NTD reporters collect information beyond the TAM requirements. So please be sure to check out the the manual on the NTD webpage to see if you are indeed required to be an NTD reporter or if you simply need to report your TAM requirements there. So number one is the data report, and this is actual numerical values that you will submit to the NTD. There are a couple of templates available, which are just examples and illustrations of what we think this data collection is going to look like. They're not the explicit data collection pages. They're just examples. But we will be collecting performance targets for the next fiscal year and system condition and performance reports. We will also be collecting a narrative report on the A90 form, and this is just an opportunity for transit providers to basically provide a narrative on how things may have changed in the year, the prior year. For instance, if you maybe changed the way you itemize your or categorized your certain asset classes, you'd want to mention that in your narrative report because your data points will shift, and you want to have some explanation of why they're shifting. Group plan sponsors are required to submit a consolidated report on behalf of their participants. And if you want a little bit more information about the relationship of NTD and TAM requirements, take a look at the crosswalk at this URL. So as I just mentioned, the asset module reporting template can be found on the NTD webpage. The URL is at the bottom of the screen. It looks a little challenging to me to see, maybe that's better, to see this page, but the shading seems a little bit light, but go to the FTA homepage, transit.dot.gov, and look for NTD, and it will take you to this page. So some of the record-keeping requirements, each transit provider, group plan sponsor, or individual TAM plan developer will need to maintain the record supporting their current TAM plan. In addition, they have to share information with their state and metropolitan planning organizations, including the TAM plan, performance targets, investment strategies, and annual condition assessments. This is indeed intended to help coordinate those targets for the state and MPO's performance measures. Also, TAM plans are self-certified by each transit provider's accountable executive. FTA is updating the certifications and assurances to reflect these requirements, and we are also reviewing how to update the triennial and state management reviews as well as MPO certification reviews to reflect these new requirements. All right, so that's all of the provisions of the final rule explicitly. Now let's talk a little bit about implementation of the rule. So where do we go from here? In our last slide, timeline slide, we ended with the final rule being published. Now we begin with it being published. And I want to point out that the effective date has been identified as October 1st, 2016. So that gives about 3 months for everyone to become familiar with what's in the final rule and participate in some of the technical assistance that FTA is providing. MAC 21 explicitly stated that we require initial targets 3 months after the effective date of the final rule. So that would put the initial targets at January 2017. as we mentioned before, the initial TAM plan compliance date is October 2018. I want to clearly identify that your TAM plan is not required to be submitted to FTA, not headquarters or your regional office. There is no requirement to submit your TAM plan, but you must have a compliant TAM plan available by October 2018. And then lastly, the TAM report's due dates are due annually with the NTD report. For those of you that don't currently report to the NTD, it is a rolling basis based on the end of your fiscal year. So within 4 months of the end of your fiscal year, your NTD report is due. This will be the same for your TAM requirements to the NTD. They would be due within 4 months of the end of your fiscal year. So this is just a different representation of the information that I just talked to you about. And also it adds a little bit of information about the frequency of those submittals. So the final rule is effective October of this year, and the first targets are due by January 2017. And they must be submitted to NTD by the end of January 2017. Each subsequent year, your targets are due within 4 months of the end of your fiscal year, which is what we call the NTD report. Your TAM plan is due. Your first one must be compliant and in place by October 2018, and every 4 years thereafter, it must be updated in its entirety. You may have some amendments over those time frames, but it must be updated in its entirety at a minimum every 4 years. For those of you that are NTD reporters, the asset inventory and the condition reporting will be due within 4 months of the end of your fiscal year 2018, and thereafter every year as part of your NTD report. I want to highlight an asterisk here that clarifies that only 1/3 of your facility's condition assessments are due in NTD report year 2018, and then another third every year until all have been completed, and then you start over again. And then lastly on this graphic, the narrative report, or where you get a chance to provide your anecdotal support for any changes, achievement or not achievement of targets, or just really any backup information you want to provide, is due within 4 months of the end of your fiscal year 2019. This is due 1 year after your TAM plan is in place and 1 year after your mandatory asset inventory and condition reporting, because you want to have targets based on complete data and your TAM plan in place before you provide a narrative about those targets. So let's walk through an example. I know up until this point I have not explicitly referenced the state DOTs. However, a state DOT is most often in the role of a group plan sponsor for their 5311 program subrecipients. In some cases also for their 5310s, depending on how your state operates. So the information that I'm providing here is a group plan example. So both small operators and state DOTs can see themselves reflected in this example. This example is based on, just to clarify, it's not based on any real world situation. This is just a illustrious, I can't say that word. It's just an example based on made-up numbers to represent walking through the different elements of TAM provisions. So these 3 questions you may ask yourself when you're starting out with the TAM plan, is this rule applicable to me? Am I Tier 1 or Tier 2? And can I participate in a group plan? So this example has two agencies. Agency A has 4 30-foot low-floor buses, and Agency B has 2 30-foot low-floor buses. And their group plan sponsor is going to group them together. So in total, this group has 6 30-foot low-floor buses, even though it's over 2 agencies. So next we would assess the condition of our asset inventory, and based on local decisions, based on local policy decisions, they have identified these criteria as being important for their condition. As you see in the second row, age of each of those vehicles is identified. And then a rating for the safety, reliability, and appearance. The next step would be to utilize some methodology. It does not need to be a software tool, but utilize some methodology to support the decisions on how to prioritize investments. In this case, bus 1 through 6, the information from our previous condition assessment is replicated in this table, and in addition, the weighting for each of these factors is included. These weightings are completely locally determined. Based on this decision support methodology, this group plan sponsor has identified these criteria, that a score of greater than 50 means this asset needs to be replaced this year. A score between 50 and 30 means that asset needs to be replaced within 3 years, and a score less than 30 means that asset has no immediate remedial action. Utilizing the weighting and the ratings of each of the vehicles in the fleet, we recognize that one vehicle, bus 1, from Agency A should be replaced this year, and 3 vehicles reflecting both Agency A and Agency B assets should be replaced within 3 years. So the TAM plan sponsors' reporting requirements would require them to set targets for their next fiscal year, and based on the information about the useful life benchmark, they would set a target of 35% of those buses exceeding the 12-year useful life benchmark. I want to remind everyone that there is no benefit for achieving your target, and there's no penalty for missing your target. The group plan sponsor would then submit their data report to the NTD, including all of the condition information from the table that we identified a few slides back, and the performance targets for their next fiscal year. They would also describe the changes from their last year report in the narrative report. So lastly, I want to talk about some of the technical assistance that is available from FTA currently and what's in process. So in this slide, the upper left-hand corner is a Term Light, which is a decision support tool that's available free of charge from our webpage. Sure. Going along that top row, the Transit Asset Management Guide is focused more so on larger systems, but it is a good place to get kind of like a solid foundation in transit asset management. In addition, TCRP has developed numerous products and reports that may be valuable in your implementation of TAM. And we've also, FTA has developed a TAM newsletter series that provides noteworthy practices amongst transit stakeholders. Directly below that is the Facility Condition and Rail Guideway Guidebooks. I've mentioned this a couple of times. These are the State of Good Repair Performance Measure Guidebooks that are currently open for notice and comment, and they give a methodology, actually a couple of methodologies to use to develop those performance measures. We're also updating all of our TAM training and expanding the curriculum for TAM training, as well as providing technical assistance opportunities like this one for webinars and other information. We also have an asset inventory development and integration guide available on our webpage. And lastly, we have our small provider guide and template. I saved this for last because I think this one is probably going to be the most useful to this group of folks. So we published this in, I think, March of 2016, and it's available right now on our webpage. And it gives you kind of an explanation of what asset management is from a small operator, bus-only rural environment. It talks about what those requirements are for small providers and other considerations. In addition, there is the template, which can help you identify compliant versus comprehensive TAM plans. So here's an excerpt from that guide. I do want to point out that this guide is also useful for state DOTs or any group plan sponsor that may be collecting information from a number of subrecipients or group plan participants. It is an Excel spreadsheet, so it can be customized based on your asset inventories, and you could potentially specialize it for your participants, share it, and have them fill in whatever information is necessary for you to do the investment prioritization and decision support methodologies. It's one way to kind of have a consistent data collection and also to share information with the group plan sponsors about what your expectations of participation may be. Again, it's totally voluntary, but it is potentially a tool that could be used to help in that environment. So this is a direct pull from the TAM template for small providers. And you can see in the bottom there are various tabs that provide information for the type of TAM plan that you're doing. If you are doing a group TAM plan, or if you're doing an individual small TAM plan. The macros can help you to figure out what the next step will be, and there are instructions embedded within the document. So please take a look at that, and I hope that it can be useful for your TAM plan development. So lastly, I'm going to take another poll, and this one is specifically about what can FTA do to help educate about TAM and what type of training opportunities or technical assistance you feel would be the most useful. So please take a second to fill this out. If your answer of choice is not in this field, please do add it to the question and answer pod. Start off with the term TA hyphen, and so that we can pull out specifically those items that are for technical assistance. All right, take a few minutes to fill this out. This is very important for FTA to provide the type of information and the technical assistance that you find the most useful. Oh. All right, it looks like most of you guys have had a chance to fill out the poll. Perhaps you are still filling in your Q&A pod, which I encourage you to do throughout the remainder of the presentation and the question and answer period, so that we can get this technical assistance that is necessary to you. So just closing out this presentation, the next steps, again, the guides are open for comment, and our next webinar will be on Thursday. I believe that is the